No Other Life presents Upstaged. Greenlight. During the first reflection in this series, I spoke about the composer Brahms and the ways in which we can feel as though we want to get something out into the world, but we don't know how to get the best part of us out there. And I use this as an illustration for how difficult it was to figure out the first piece of music to talk about on this podcast. And now I'm going to talk similarly about being frozen, if you will, to inaction. I remember a few years back, I really wanted to begin to be a composer. And I think I mentioned on a previous episode, or probably will at another point in time, that when I was working in a church music position during the pandemic, there was a lot of creativity required because we were constantly trying to explore new ways to make music, but we couldn't be with each other. And so I found a variety of ways to get my usual singers to make music on their own effectively, but then gel it all together later on. And I certainly wasn't creative force charging up the hill to do this. Many people were doing this at the time, and many of them in extraordinary ways. But I did my best, and I took some files that people would record in their home alone, and they would send these files to me, and I would try to put them together. And we had some good times, and we had some pretty nice results. And there was one time where I remember particularly that there was a piece that when I was a young person, every mother in the country just loved this pop tune. And it was coming upon Mother's Day, if I remember correctly. So this was probably 2021, maybe. And I asked our accompanist if she would record a version of this piece. And she dug it out and did an extraordinary job on the piano. And as I was listening back to it and thinking about the fact that I had requested this piece in honor of my mother, it caused me to start to think about the period that this whole thing would have been starting in my mind, like when I was in high school, and made me think back to what I was doing musically at that point in time. And one of the things that I just loved in the late 90s was this whole new age music that came about as a result of many a PBS telethon special. We had Yanni at the Acropolis and John Tesh at Red Rocks, and my future wife, she brought to the relationship a number of Enya CDs, and I just loved the exploration of all of those composers with live instruments and synthesizers and putting them all together. I loved movie soundtracks, and I would have loved nothing more at one period than to be a movie composer. It was honestly just about the best thing that I could imagine happening. But then, as I've attested to elsewhere, I ended up more focusing on performance and kind of put this composing and arranging thing to the side. But for whatever reason, I said to myself, this really sounds like it could use something else. And I had this piano file. And one thing that I could do was add a line to it. And so I got out my MIDI keyboard, which at that point I didn't have a lot of experience with, to be honest. And I can't even remember what software I was using at the time. But I got out a very 90s sounding synthesizer with a ton of reverb and a beautiful glide to the pitch bend. And I just wrote this counter melody that I sat above the piano. And I played it, and I thought, this is amazing. It really truly was nothing special. Nothing that a million people before me had ever done. That is, layering instruments on top of each other. Woo! But I hadn't done it before, and there were some early attempts to do stuff like this, but for the most part, I was starting to find my way. And there was a piece I had kind of fooled around with at the time, but it was mostly just one part, or, two hands, but then one part got doubled and some other instruments and so on. But it was that experience of exploration that really set me on the path toward doing what it was that I was hoping to do with all of this. And I had this grand vision, but didn't really know what to do with it. I've historically been someone who gets very squeamish when it's time to have someone else see my work in progress. I typically don't have a problem with putting a finished product out there and standing behind it. But when it comes to doing some sort of collaboration, when it comes to putting a work in progress out and being brave enough to let someone else observe it and maybe even critique it, that's just not for me. It doesn't really work for me. And there's probably millions of reasons why this is the case, but it's the case. The main reason is that I pretty much know what I am hearing in my mind most of the time when we're talking about musical creation. And it might take me some exploration to get there. Once I get there, I'm ready to stand behind it, stand by it. But until then, it's difficult. And so at this point, I was beginning to learn arranging again, having been in college, music school 20 years ago, 25 maybe even now. So I was getting my fingers back under that, and composition in general, and choosing textures, and music production was pretty new to me altogether. So all these things were going on at the same time. And every time I came up with a musical theme, I was kind of opening a Pandora's box, because all of a sudden then I wanted to do more with that. Or I came up with a different theme the next day, and now I have 2 files that aren't done. And I realized that what I was going to need to do was begin to release music. Because when you release something, for the most part, you are saying, I am done. Now, you might come back to it for a remaster later. You might rearrange it entirely or scrap half the tracks and rework the others. I don't have a problem with that by any stretch. But for the most part, you put something in the world, you're saying, it's time for you to hear this. Now I'm going to move on. And so rather than have 30 projects where every once in a while I come back to one and say, oh, maybe it needs this, or let's take away this, I really needed to enter that commit stage on more and more projects because my mind was starting to get into the creativity, and ultimately I was just coming up with ideas on a weekly basis, let's say. So I got the idea to put out a first EP, a short album. And I was going to do that. Actually, I was thinking of doing it in 2022. Maybe my chronology is all off on this. I really don't know. It doesn't matter. But there was a World Parkinson's Day, which is April 11th. And whatever year it was, I was planning to put out an EP headlined by one track and a bunch of other things that had been, personal projects as I got my hands under all this stuff. And the pieces didn't come together. And I realized that I wanted it to be different. I felt I needed to learn more. There was more that I needed to tackle and really digest before I could comfortably say, yeah, it's ready, enjoy, like I was saying earlier. So I said, before the end of 2022, I got to do this. I need to jump and get moving. So this project was going to be called A Friend in the Dark, and I thought, perfect. Friend in the Dark, darkest day of the year, winter solstice, let's do it. You'll notice throughout the No Other Life project as well that I'm kind of obsessed with solstices and equinoxes, not for any astrological, astronomical, title reasons, none of that. It's simply, I like the way they divide up the year. So I thought I would do that. But then it came and blew through as well. And by this point, those files are becoming precious to me. They are those that I have lived with now for like a year. And I think it was 6 tracks. That's all it was. And I couldn't do something with them by the end of 22. But we were coming up on Christmas. I was running out of time. So what did I do? Grabbed a piece that I hadn't been planning to do anything with and got it finished. And I believe I released it over on Bandcamp on New Year's Eve, but maybe it was the next day. I don't remember exactly, but I symbolically said it's done. And then the world was open to me. As I finally get to the important part of the story, when I released this piece, I had a good response from some friends that I knew, and some of them bought the track, and that made me feel extraordinary. And it was the beginning for me. And it's funny that sometimes at a point like this, you think that you are headed toward the end, that goal of yours, in this case, release a piece of music before the end of a calendar year. You set that up as a resolution of sorts, be it New Year's or otherwise, and that's your goal. You even use the word goal. But it wasn't. What I needed was a starting line. I didn't need a finish line because what's the point of getting all of that training, doing all of that extremely personal and passionate work to do one thing, drop the mic, and get out? Now, I never intended. I always knew that this was to become part of a new part of me. But I was thinking of it as a checkered flag and not as a green light. And that's where I regularly go wrong. 2023 was transformative for me. I was in the middle of a very difficult, scary health situation with my mom at that point, and creativity just poured out of me. And I just knew this is what I need to be doing. I need to write in order to explore all that's on my mind right now. And I did it. And it's all because of that green light that I got permission from myself to move forward. Now, I've listened to this piece a few times in the year, and I've done different things beyond that since then. But this one will always hold a place in my heart. Would I write it differently now? I don't know. I still think there's some pretty cool stuff in there. Would I produce it now differently? Absolutely. Would I perform it now differently? Absolutely. As we go through the rest of this podcast series, you'll find me say many times that I've become different through Parkinson's because I focus so much on the dexterity and the motor issues. I'm a better piano player than I used to be, and so I know that I would play this differently. But it's all about the intention of it. And by doing this and releasing it, it led to the album for my mom. It led to more understanding of principles of orchestration and arranging and notation, all of these things that I learned in music school but just wasn't using. You're about to hear in its entirety that first track that I ever released, which has led to many more. This is Snowrise. That was the single called Snowrise. And if you really liked that track, just keep playing this podcast over and over again. It started about 18 minutes into the show, I would think. Or head over to rickseahome.com for the latest news, archived social media, or to purchase any of the music you hear on this podcast. Both Upstaged and the No Other Life project are independently conceived of and managed by me, Rick Seahome, ad-free and without interruption for all listeners. I really appreciate your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, spread the word with friends. It's the number one way to keep this going. Friends, you have no other life, and it's the grandest improv session of them all. Own what you bring to the scene and share it with all whom you meet.